They say redemption begins the moment you stop trying to prove yourself. But what happens when your entire life has been a monument to pride? Now, here you are, the battle with Majin Buu behind you, standing beside Kakarot, not as a rival, but as an equal. You once swore you'd surpass him, destroy him if needed. Now, you've entrusted the fate of the world to him. Strange, isn't it? To live for pride, and then find peace in surrender. What changed? How did a prince who once knelt to no one finally bow? Not out of defeat, but out of growth. That's what brings you here today. Not the battles, not the titles, but the quiet question that's haunted you ever since. What was I really fighting for? You were born into power, but raised in chains. As Prince of all Saiyans, your title meant glory, yet the reality was submission. You were a child when Frieza destroyed your planet, and in the aftermath, you became his instrument, not his equal, not his threat, a weapon to be sharpened and deployed. You told yourself it was temporary, that biding your time was strategy, not fear. But deep inside, something else took root. How much of your pride was born from defiance, and how much from humiliation too raw to name? You stood before Frieza and his generals, arms folded, eyes defiant, even as your orders were barked like commands to a dog. You followed them, not because you believed in them, but because you believed in yourself. You believed your power would grow, that one day you'd turn on them all. But every time you carried out another mission, every time you raised a planet, crushed a city, slaughtered the weak, you buried another piece of yourself under the illusion of control. Was your pride growing stronger? Or were you building a wall to keep the shame from seeping through? As you carved a bloody legacy across the stars, you began to speak of yourself in absolutes, the strongest, the elite, the chosen. You believed saying it enough would make it true. The memory of your father, killed with the rest of your people, wasn't a wound you let fester. It was a weapon. His death became your motivation, your justification, your fire. But still, at night, when the battles were done, there was no throne, no kingdom, only silence. And in that silence, you asked yourself, if I am royalty, why do I serve? You never answered that question, not then. You pushed it down. You trained harder, killed faster, spoke louder. Because pride was the only thing you had left that hadn't been stripped from you. You wore it like armor, but you never stopped wondering what was underneath. What is pride if it's not seen? What is a prince if he rules nothing? These were the first whispers, quiet truths that pride tried to bury. But even then, in your darkest moments, they echoed. You knew your role, and you played it well. You were one of Frieza's most dangerous weapons, an enforcer whose name struck fear into entire star systems. You destroyed planets, led invasions, and crushed resistance with ruthless precision. To others, it looked like loyalty. To you, it was a long game. Every mission you accepted, every soldier you slaughtered was part of the performance. You were biding your time, sharpening your blade, waiting for the moment to take everything back. You convinced yourself that your compliance was power in disguise. But was it? Or was your pride simply adapting to servitude, one scar at a time? When you looked at Frieza, you didn't see a leader. You saw your captor, your usurper. But you also saw the line you could never cross. No matter how strong you became, his power eclipsed yours. And so, you smiled through gritted teeth. You took his orders, even as your fingers twitched with the urge to wrap around his throat. Every day you lived beneath his shadow was another day you promised yourself it wouldn't last. But your hatred wasn't pure. It was laced with something darker. Envy. Was your rage really about your people? Or was it about your pride being crushed by someone you could never defeat? You kept your distance from the other warriors. Nappa followed you like a loyal dog, and Raditz barely registered. You didn't need them. You didn't need anyone. That's what you told yourself. You were proud, self-sufficient. But isolation doesn't breed strength. It breeds silence. You trained alone, fought alone, slept alone. You wore solitude like a badge of honor, but in truth, it was armor. You feared connection because connection meant being seen. And what would they see if they looked past the prince? This was your ordinary world. Domination, bloodshed, and internal contradiction. You were both servant and sovereign, prisoner and predator. Every act of violence felt like control. Every mission completed felt like progress. But at your core, you were drifting, chained not by Frieza, but by the lie you told yourself every day, that your pride made you free. You didn't know yet that real pride, earned pride, comes not from fear, but from choice. And you hadn't made any real choices. Not yet. You descended onto Earth, expecting nothing but a massacre. This planet was an afterthought, just another weak world to be purged. Yet another step toward reclaiming the pride you lost under Frieza. You didn't come to conquer it. You came to remind the galaxy who you were. You came to prove to yourself and to everyone watching that the Saiyan Prince was still the pinnacle of power. But when you faced Kakarot, when you felt his strength swell beyond anything you expected, something inside you buckled. Not your body, not yet. It was something deeper. What do you do when the thing you've built your entire identity around begins to fracture in real time? You told yourself it was an anomaly, that his strength was borrowed, artificial, temporary. But every blow he landed chipped away at your conviction. He didn't just match you, he defied you. He fought with purpose, not just power, with connection, not just instinct. And worst of all, he didn't fight with pride. He fought with heart, the kind of heart you had buried long ago. You called it weakness, but standing there, bloodied, beaten, you began to wonder, what if pride without purpose is just noise? When the fight turned against you, your rage became desperation. You summoned the Gallic gun. You pushed your power beyond what your body could endure. Yet, he rose to meet you, not just with brute force, but with a spirit bomb, a weapon born from the trust of others. You had no one to call upon, no one who would lend you their energy. You were alone, by design. And suddenly, that pride you once wore like armor began to feel a lot more like a cage. Isolated, empty, hollow. And then, the final blow. He spared you. After all your rage, after all your threats, after swearing you'd destroy this world, Kakarot let you go. That moment shattered something primal. You had never felt weaker, never felt more exposed. You weren't beaten by strength, you were undone by mercy. And in that mercy, a question echoed louder than any battle cry. If I am not the strongest, then who am I? You fled Earth in shame, though you'd never call it that. You called it strategy. You told yourself you needed time to recover, to plan, to grow stronger. But the truth was simpler. You couldn't bear the weight of what had just happened, being spared, outmatched, made irrelevant. You set your sights on Namek, not just for immortality, but for redemption. The Dragon Balls were a means to an end. You didn't want eternal life for the joy of living. You wanted it so you'd never be defeated again. Because if pride is your foundation, then loss feels like annihilation. Even on Namek, surrounded by enemies on all sides, you chose solitude. Gohan and Krillin offered uneasy alliances, opportunities to cooperate, to reflect, to grow. But you couldn't accept them. You barked orders, issued threats, manipulated and deceived. It wasn't because you lacked trust. It was because you feared what trust might reveal. What if working together meant acknowledging weakness? What if accepting help meant admitting you weren't enough on your own? The more you clung to the illusion of superiority, the more your pride began to turn inward, festering into something bitter. You weren't just angry at Kakarot anymore. You were angry at yourself. Angry that no matter how hard you pushed, he always seemed to rise higher. And worst of all, he didn't even seem to care. That apathy, that joy he fought with, it was unbearable. You told yourself he was lucky, gifted, but deep down you knew he was free and you weren't. Could it be that what you called strength was just a disguise for fear? When you failed to summon your immortality, when the Dragon Balls were taken and your plans unraveled, you didn't reflect. You raged. You told yourself the universe conspired against you, that fate was robbing you of what was rightfully yours. But it wasn't fate, it was your own refusal to change. You had been given chances on Earth, on Namek, in the eyes of those you dismissed, but you chose to stay the same, because change, real change, requires vulnerability, and you still believed pride would protect you from that. Would you rather be powerful or whole? You never asked for a teacher, not in the traditional sense. To be mentored was to be molded, and you refused to be shaped by anyone but yourself. But life has a way of slipping mentors into your path without permission. When you found yourself fighting alongside Gohan and Krillin, two Earthlings you once threatened to kill, you didn't call it unity, you called it necessity. And yet, something in you shifted. Standing beside them, fighting together against the Ginyu force, you caught a glimpse of something foreign. Trust. Not earned, not invited, but offered freely. What kind of strength is that, when someone chooses to believe in you without proof? Gohan, the boy you had once terrorized, walked beside you without hesitation. There was no hatred in his fists, no fear in his eyes, only determination. Krillin, though cautious, didn't run. He covered your flank, took hits meant for you. You told yourself they were fools, naive, weak. But still, you didn't walk away. You fought with them, and for the first time in years, your back wasn't exposed. You were part of something, even if just for a moment. Why did that feel more dangerous than any enemy you'd ever faced? Their strength wasn't in raw power, it was in connection. They fought harder because they fought for each other. That realization disturbed you more than Frieza ever had. You had always believed that pride meant isolation, that needing others diluted your worth. But watching them, feeling their support, you started to question the dogma you'd clung to for so long. What if power wasn't measured by how much you could destroy, but by how much you could protect, and who you choose to stand with? You didn't call them allies, you didn't thank them, you didn't let your guard down. Not yet. But something stayed with you long after the battle ended. The memory of being trusted, of being part of something, even if your pride wouldn't let you name it. And maybe, just maybe, you started to wonder, had your whole life been a resistance, not to weakness, but to the risk of being seen? You always thought transformation would feel like victory, that when it finally happened, when you ascended to the legendary state of the Super Saiyan, it would come with triumph, with glory. But when it came, there was no celebration, no audience, only silence and shame. You reached it not through honor or clarity, but through collapse. You stood alone on a distant world, exhausted, broken, screaming at the heavens, not out of power, but out of emptiness. The transformation didn't crown you, it crushed you. What does it mean when the thing you chased your entire life brings no peace at all? You had chased that form for years, haunted by the fact that Kakarot reached it before you. You saw this as the key to reclaiming your status, your legacy, your pride. But no matter how hard you trained, no matter how much you pushed, it eluded you. And when it finally came, it didn't come from rage towards others. It came from rage at yourself. Rage for being second. Rage for pretending you didn't care. Rage for the deep secret truth that you had been fighting a ghost of who you thought you were supposed to be. Had you become strong to protect your pride, or because you had nothing left inside but rage? In that moment, as lightning cracked around you and your aura burned gold, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. You had everything you wanted, yet it felt like nothing. The title meant less than the journey, and the journey had cost you more than you ever admitted. You began to realize that power obtained through pain doesn't heal anything. It only buries the wound deeper. And the pride you once worshipped, it was hollow. It had pushed everyone away. It had left you to ascend alone. Is power worth it if no one is left to witness it? Crossing that threshold didn't make you whole. It made you honest. For the first time, you couldn't lie to yourself about what drove you. It wasn't nobility. It wasn't revenge. It was fear. Fear that without being the strongest, you would be nothing. But now, standing on the other side of that transformation, you began to see something else. What if the next evolution isn't power, but peace? You didn't know what to do with him at first. Trunks, your son, your blood, stood before you as both stranger and mirror. You had your eyes, your fire, but none of your walls. He was open, expressive, unashamed to feel. That unnerved you. You had no blueprint for fatherhood, no model to follow except a king who taught you silence and pride. So you did what you always did. You trained. You brought him in the time chamber, thinking sweat and pain would do what words couldn't. You told yourself this was how Saiyans bond. But was that training for him or for you? Inside the chamber, time stood still, and so did your excuses. You were forced to face not just Cell, but your own reflection through your son's gaze. Trunks didn't fight like you. He didn't hunger for glory. He fought to protect, not to prove. He grew stronger, yes, but he also grew disappointed. You saw it in his eyes every time you dismissed him, every time your pride demanded the last word. He wanted something from you that power couldn't give. Acknowledgement, maybe even love, and that terrified you more than any enemy you ever had. When the fight with Cell arrived, the test came, not of strength, but of identity. After your defeat at the hands of Cell, and Due to your unwavering pride, Trunks stepped forward to protect you, revealing his hidden strength. He surpassed your expectations, maybe even your limits, but instead of pride, you felt rage, not at him, but at yourself, because you realized in that moment that your pride had stunted something sacred. He had become the man you were too afraid to be. Was your pride building a legacy or breaking one? And still, you held on, even as Cell returned, even as your arrogance nearly doomed them all. You lashed out, demanded control, tried to reclaim the throne you believed was slipping away. But your enemies weren't just androids and monsters. They were the emotions you'd never faced, the ally you never thanked, the son you didn't know how to reach, and the truth you kept running from, that the battle you feared most wasn't with Cell, it was with your own reflection. You told yourself it was strategy, that letting Babidi take control of your mind was a calculated risk, an opportunity to access power long buried. But that wasn't the truth, and you knew it. The moment you stood still and let the mark burn into your forehead, you weren't embracing strength, you were surrendering to pride. You missed who you used to be, before Earth, before Trunks, before vulnerability. You missed the clarity that rage once gave you, so you reached for it, even knowing it would cost you everything. What does it mean to knowingly choose your worst self just to feel like yourself again? You told no one, not Bulma, not Trunks. You kept your distance. You told yourself they'd never understand, that Saiyan pride couldn't coexist with family. But that was a lie. The truth was harder to face. You felt like a fraud. The more you softened, the more you questioned whether your strength was slipping. You mistook peace for weakness, love for dilution, and the silence inside you, it was unbearable. So you sought noise, chaos. You thought if you fought Kakarot again, if you beat him this time, everything you hated about yourself would burn away. But what if the fire wasn't purification, but self-destruction? When the transformation hit, you felt euphoric. The power was real. Hatred returned. You called it clarity, but it was desperation. You looked at yourself through Babidi's influence and saw the version of you that had always felt pure, untouched by emotion, untainted by loss. You mistook regression for restoration. But deep down, even as you laughed in bloodlust, you knew this wasn't ascension, it was retreat. Was your pride really alive, or just afraid of who you were becoming? And then, the worst part, it worked. You stood toe-to-toe with Kakarot. You traded blows like the rivals you once were. But even then, with the world crumbling around you, it didn't feel like triumph. Not really. It felt like emptiness. You had everything you said you wanted. The power, the fight, the fury. And in that, it meant nothing. You had to lose yourself completely. just to feel like yourself again. And in doing so, what part of you was lost for good? You stood over Trunks, placing your hand on his head for the first time, not as a warrior, but as a father. It was awkward, clumsy, quiet. There were no words of greatness, no promises of legacy, only a gesture of love you had denied yourself the right to express for too long. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. Your pride, the one thing that had defined you, protected you, driven you, finally bent. Not because you were defeated, but because you chose to lower it. Not for your sake, but for his. What does it mean to die, not for honor or revenge, but for love? You had always believed sacrifice was for the weak, that those who laid down their lives did so because they lacked the strength to win. But standing there, knowing Majin Buu couldn't be stopped with fists alone, you didn't feel weak. You felt clear. The power Babidi gave you meant nothing now. You saw through the illusion. This wasn't strength. It was desperation masked in energy. And the only way to reclaim yourself was to give everything away. Could true strength come not from holding on, but from letting go? As your energy flared and your body tore itself apart, you thought of Kakarot, not with jealousy, but with understanding. You finally saw why he fought the way he did. It wasn't for pride or victory, it was for others, for something bigger than himself. You had mocked him for years, refused to understand, but now, as your life burned out in light, you understood. And in that understanding, you felt peace, not victory, not validation, but peace. Had you wasted all those years chasing a crown when what you truly needed was connection? And then came the silence. The dust settled. The light faded. You were gone, but not empty. For the first time in your life, you didn't need to be seen, didn't need to win, didn't need to be the Prince of Saiyans. You were simply enough. Not because you proved yourself to the universe, but because you chose to protect what mattered. And in that final breath, you discovered the truth your pride had kept from you all along. Love is not the enemy of strength, it is the reason to wield it. You opened your eyes in the afterlife, not to chaos or applause, but to quiet. No battlefield, no enemy, just reflection. You expected to feel rage, that you had failed, that your sacrifice had been meaningless. And you did, but also, instead, you felt still. The war inside your chest, the one that had screamed your whole life, had fallen silent. And in that stillness, you could finally hear something else. Clarity. You saw your choices not as victories or defeats, but as steps. Painful, selfish, human steps towards something you never knew you were capable of. Peace. You watched Goku fight Buu, but this time from the outside looking in. And for the first time, you weren't filled with envy. You didn't compare. You didn't compete. You observed. You listened. He fought with everything you'd always dismissed: joy, empathy, vulnerability. And he didn't fight alone. The earth, the people, even his enemies rallied behind him. His strength wasn't his own. It was shared, built through love and trust and 1,000 bonds you once deemed weak. Could it be that you had spent your whole life chasing a power he had never needed to seek? You thought of Trunks, of Bulma, of the family you'd once regarded as background to your battle. You remembered the way Trunks cried as you pushed him away, and how Bulma's voice cracked when she said your name in fear. You never fought for them. Not truly. You fought despite them, and yet they remained. They waited. They loved you even when you gave them reasons not to. In that, you found something deeper than forgiveness. You found a reason. Isn't that all any warrior truly wants? To fight for something real. The reward wasn't in resurrection. It was in praise. It was in release. Release from the chains of a title that had ruled your life. Release from the rage that had defined your strength. And release from the lie that pride was your only identity. In letting go, you made space for something else. A man, a father, a protector, partner. You weren't perfect, but you were free. And in that freedom, you found a strength greater than any transformation. The power to choose who you want to become. You felt the pull before the light returned. One moment, you were watching from afar, weightless, formless, and the next, your body was whole again, revived, reinstated, returned. The Dragon Balls had given you a second chance, but it wasn't just your life they restored. It was the question you thought you'd already answered. Now that you've changed, what will you do with the man you've become? Coming back wasn't the reward. Living with what you now knew, that was the challenge. As you arrived beside Goku on the battlefield, the air burned with chaos. Kid Buu was pure destruction, unthinking, relentless, without pride, without fear. Everything you once glorified. And for the first time, you saw it clearly, how empty that kind of power really was. Buu fought like the version of yourself you had finally shed, unanchored by love, unburdened by purpose. And suddenly, your own past felt foreign, not shameful, but distant. You weren't that man anymore, but could you now stand as something else, and not collapse under the weight of your own evolution? You fought again, yes, but this time, not to prove anything. You didn't chase superiority. You didn't measure yourself against Kakarot. You fought because you had people to return to, not a kingdom, family, a life. And even as you struggled, even as your body faltered, you didn't fear the outcome. You had already made peace with your pride. What mattered now was something else entirely. Did you have the courage to live the change, not just die for it? The road back wasn't paved in victories. It was slow, uneven. Sometimes it meant watching others lead. Sometimes it meant holding back, letting go, stepping aside. It meant learning to speak when silence had been your weapon. It meant letting your family see your flaws. And through it all, you asked yourself, can I be strong even when I'm no longer the strongest? That question lingered. It still does. But now, you no longer fear it, because now you're walking down the road not to reclaim your past, but to build your future. You watched him rise, Kakarot, gathering the energy of an entire planet into one final blow. It was poetic, in a way, that the fate of the universe would not rest in your hands, but in his. The same man you had vowed to surpass, the rival who had haunted your pride since the moment you met him. And yet, as a spirit bomb formed overhead, you felt no bitterness, no resentment, only clarity. You had spent your whole life chasing a shadow, only to realize that you were never in the same race. The thought came unforced, soft, sincere. You're better than me, Kakarot. You are the best. You hadn't planned to think it. You didn't even consider it until the thought crept into your mind. But it wasn't defeat that made you say it. It was liberation. For the first time, you let go of the need to be more than someone else. You weren't measuring anymore. You were witnessing. And what you saw wasn't a rival. It was a friend. A man with whom you had shared more than battles. You had shared evolution. Could it be that strength was never about surpassing others, but about embracing yourself? You remembered your own power, your own sacrifice, your own moments of rage, your own brushes with death. They hadn't been wasted. They had shaped you, hardened you, but they had also taught you. The pain had been your teacher, but it didn't need to be your identity. You could carry those lessons forward without dragging the wounds. You didn't need to keep proving your worth. You had already done so, in silence, in sacrifice, in love. So what does a man do when he no longer needs to fight for his pride? He finally begins to live. When the blast landed and Boo was no more, the world didn't cheer your name. No one crowned you. No one bowed. But you felt something far deeper than victory. You felt reborn, not in power, but in peace. You weren't just Vegeta, Prince of all Saiyans. You were Vegeta, father to Trunks, partner to Bulma, ally to Kakarot, defender of Earth, the man who had once lived for pride and now lived for something far greater. And in that quiet resurrection, you found your true strength, not as a warrior, but as a man. You came back to Earth not as a victor, but as something rarer, a man at peace with himself. There were no grand pronouncements, no armies waiting, just your family, Bulma, waiting with eyes that held forgiveness you'd never asked for. Trunks, still bursting with questions, still hoping to be seen. And you, standing at the threshold of a life you'd once thought made you weak. You stepped inside, not as a warrior wounded by compromise, but as someone who finally understood what pride was supposed to mean. Not a shield, but a standard. Something to carry, not something to hide behind. You started small, sitting at the table during dinner, speaking when it mattered, listening even when it hurt. There were nights you still stayed silent, mornings where the old habits whispered back, but you didn't let them rule you anymore. You trained with Trunks, not to toughen him, but to know him. You laughed, even if it felt strange. And one day, without ceremony, you placed a hand on his shoulder, not as a lesson, but as a gesture. And he didn't flinch. In that quiet moment, did you finally become the father your own never had the chance to be? Kakarot didn't gloat. He didn't bring up the fight, the spirit bomb, or how you thought once you confessed to him that he was the best. He simply greeted you the same way he always had, like none of it changed anything. But everything had changed. You no longer saw him as a rival. You saw him as a brother in battle. A mirror, perhaps, of the man you might have become had your life started with love instead of loss. You weren't trying to catch up to him anymore. You were walking beside him. And, for the first time, you weren't ashamed of your pace. Isn't that what growth is? Letting go of the race and choosing the road instead? You once thought the elixir would be power, a form, a title. But it's none of those things. It's this: the ability to stand amongst those you love without needing to prove anything. It's waking up without rage as your compass.